While gauging the GPU performance of the Switch 2 was somewhat doable, the CPU performance has always been unclear. Now, we know the Switch can handle the Phantom Liberty expansion on what's apparently a 7-week port of Cyberpunk. Will this or anything else announced be a good way to gauge the CPU performance of the Switch 2? Now, this is tricky. It's tricky because the Switch 2 is an SoC, right? The CPU is sharing a lot of resources with the GPU. So the amount of CPU resource at any given point could vary according to what the GPU is doing and vice versa, which actually makes judging what the CPU is capable of quite challenging, I'd suspect, Oliver.
Yes, that's a good question. But if we want to dive into that possibly thorny topic, in a lot of single core metrics that I can pull up here, the Cortex A78 in the Switch 2 is in the ballpark of about twice as fast as the A57 in the Switch 1 in clock isolated performance. So at 1 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz, that's roughly where they're at. In that ballpark, it seems. Now, some are higher than that, some are lower than that, but it seems to be roughly within that ballpark, at least in some of the synthetics. Now, I can't find like any examples where someone is comparing, a phone with the A57 to a phone with the A78 or something, because they're from such different vintages. They're, 5 years apart. No one would realistically compare these devices. But that seems to be the rough inclination that I'm getting from these benchmarks I can pull up here. It has wider execution. It has better branch prediction, has more cache. And then, of course, the other critical aspect of this is that, the Switch 1 did technically have 8 cores in that SoC. The A53 cores were disabled, as they were, I believe, in all Tegra X1 implementations. The belief there is that possibly those were not working because of a hardware bug, so they were never enabled. And obviously they were not important in the Switch 1 probably anyways. But here we're doubling the amount of cores. That is a really significant improvement there. So in games that can really make use of all those threads, you might be looking at 3 times faster CPU performance, 4 times faster. Again, if you're just looking at the multi-threaded numbers there and not really getting hung up on like a render thread or something, possibly that's what could be going on. And as far as I understand for Cyberpunk, it's a very, very heavily multi-threaded game. It can take great advantage of many, many threads there, on PC at least. So you'd presume that behavior would persist onto the Switch 2 version. So that would be roughly my inclination would be to say that, yeah, it would be a lot faster than the Switch 1, even if, as has been rumored, the clocks might not be that different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alex, thoughts?
I mean, the CPU there, I don't have nearly as much insight in this as Oliver does because he's a Switch 2 guy. But in regards to that, I would just say we're also seeing this game, in regards to Cyberpunk, not running on x86, which is one of the few times we've seen it natively running there on something that isn't x86. And, it's really hard to also gauge. Our usual referent is something we can do with PC parts, and we don't have those PC parts. So getting any sense of that is actually a lot of guessing. I would say yep. Oliver's doing his best here. The best thing we could maybe look at is like looking at the ARM compatibility layer stuff that is enabled in Windows, which, Rich, you did take a look a bit with the Qualcomm.
Yeah, it's very difficult to actually tell because the GPU driver was a disaster area.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
That's something you don't have to worry about on Switch 2, that's for sure.
No.
I mean, this is a difficult one because there's another sort of not so much an elephant in the room, perhaps a baby elephant, which is what is the system resources that are reserved by Nintendo for stuff like game chat, for stuff like the operating system. This will take the form of, on Switch 1, you had 4 cores, but developers could only use 3 of them. Mm-hmm. What is the equivalence on Switch 2? We don't know. How much of that 12 gigabytes of memory is actually available to developers? We don't know that, I don't think, at the moment either. Mm-hmm. And GPU time, there's always a certain amount of OS overhead that eats a little bit into the GPU there. So that's other stuff we don't know.
I don't know exactly how that GPU is time sliced necessarily. Like if game share is a feature that's going to work with very many games, are they kind of allocating that GPU time as a permanent thing, like on Kinect, right? Where with the original Xbox One OS there, they were allocating, I think, 10% of the GPU to Kinect functionality at all times, even in games that didn't really support Kinect. So I guess that's a question. And also in the Ask Nintendo segments that have been published thus far, they've discussed having increased system functionalities for features like game chat that possibly do take away a little bit from the performance of the unit for actual game rendering, for actual game processing, and they discussed finding a balance there. So to some degree, hopefully, some of that slack is going to be picked up by fixed function units, by specialty hardware like the Tensor Cores for doing things that are kind of crazy to see in a device like this, like real-time AI, background removal, and face tracking and things like this. And audio, certainly probably those audio features as well to improve the audio quality, even when you're speaking to the Switch from a very far distance, right? Hopefully those are leveraging some AI features as well. But, you know, exactly what impact that has on game performance, that will remain to be seen. And I'd also be a little bit curious to see if in a game when you enabled those features, if possibly there was possibly some amount of detectable performance hit, or if they would have that factored into the game's performance from the start.
Yeah, there's also going to be some scenarios where there will be ports of games where we know a specific area of that game is CPU heavy on other platforms. The classic example being the Cherry Blossom Marketplace in Cyberpunk 2077. They compare that back, but there's always going to, you should have, if you're seeing similarly large performance drops on the Switch port, you can possibly sort of extrapolate that you're CPU limited there. So, yeah, I guess it's just a case of seeing, what happens in any given game. Again, going back to the port of The Witcher 3 on Switch 1, you go into Novigrad and performance takes a nosedive, and you can be pretty much assuming there that it's the CPU limitation in effect. So, yeah, there's going to be a lot of conjecture, I suspect, but you should be able to get some idea of what's going on CPU side in games that we're quite familiar with. But I guess we just need to see because, as things stand, we've not even been hands-on. I mean, when I do go hands-on, that Cherry Blossom Marketplace, I'll be there straight away just to see what's going on there.